Acho que mais pessoas entrando, mas a gente vai começando por aqui. Boa noite a todos, é um prazer imenso recebê-los aqui hoje. Eu sou a Camila, sou gerente de inovação daqui do Einstein, e prazer maior ainda trazer um tema tão emergente como estudos clínicos descentralizados, algo que a gente vem trabalhando aqui dentro da instituição desde o ano passado, e tem muita novidade vindo por aí ainda, e a gente vai trazer um pouquinho do conceito, o que é, né, do que se trata estudos clínicos descentralizados, onde ele se aplica, será que eu consigo fazer estudos clínicos descentralizados por si só, ou eventualmente eu posso fazer um estudo híbrido? Quais as principais vantagens de um estudo clínico descentralizado, né? A gente tem visto que existe a possibilidade de um recrutamento de um maior número de pacientes, de uma diversidade maior, enfim. Eu não vou me alongar muito, porque nós temos aqui um time de peso que vai falar sobre esse assunto. E para começar, eu vou chamar o Dr. Otávio Berbanger, que é nosso diretor aqui da Academic Research Organization do Einstein. Ele vai começar trazendo o contexto, né, de estudos clínicos descentralizados, para que todos ficamos na mesma página. E, pessoal, a ideia desse evento é uma discussão para que todos possam tirar suas dúvidas, enfim, que a gente possa discutir o tema. Então, todos são convidados para discutir. Quem quiser entrar aqui, inclusive, com a gente para discutir, basta erguer a mãozinha no Zoom, e aí a nossa equipe traz vocês para cá, para fazer as perguntas de maneira direta aos nossos palestrantes, e para quem ficar mais tímido e não quiser, também pode deixar as perguntas no chat. Quem quiser fazer perguntas ao Dr. Mikhail também pode colocar em português que a gente traduz. Dr. Otávio, por favor, fique à vontade.
Tá. Muito obrigado a todos. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Mikhail. Thanks for being with us tonight in this ERETSBio Innovation Day, where we'll discuss decentralized clinical trials. I'll switch a bit to Portuguese, and then I'll switch back to English when Mikhail will start, before Mikhail starts his presentation. Então, pessoal, é um prazer muito grande a gente discutir. Esse é o segundo evento sobre estudos descentralizados, né? Então, a gente tem hoje aqui representado a nossa diretoria de inovação, né, a ERETSBio, com a Camila, o nosso grupo de Big Data, com o Edson, eu representando o time da RO do Einstein, e daqui a pouquinho vou apresentar o nosso convidado internacional, o Dr. Mikhail Kosiborod. E o tema de estudos descentralizados, que vinha numa crescente mesmo antes da pandemia, obviamente com a pandemia ele ficou muito mais em voga, né? E há inclusive um legado em relação à pandemia. Eu vou mostrar alguns slides bem rápidos aqui, só para introduzir o tema de estudos descentralizados. A Camila só me confirma se já dá para ver a minha tela.
Conseguimos ver.
Então, por que a importância dessa questão de estudos descentralizados, né? O que são os estudos descentralizados? Então, imagina que a gente tem dois domínios assim. Um primeiro domínio, basicamente, é aonde os dados são capturados. E o segundo domínio é como os dados são capturados. Então, no modelo tradicional de pesquisa clínica, num estudo clínico randomizado tradicional, por exemplo, vejam que sempre a gente tem a figura de um intermediário. Então, o paciente, né, aonde os dados são capturados? Eles são capturados fisicamente num centro de pesquisa, quer dizer, eu tenho um time de pesquisa, um investigador, o subinvestigador, né, a coordenadora de pesquisa, ela olha o protocolo, critérios de inclusão e exclusão, e é ali que se faz o screening de pacientes, se aplica os critérios de elegibilidade, o paciente é convidado, o paciente consente e ele entra no estudo. Por exemplo, ele é randomizado num estudo clínico. E os dados, em geral, todos são coletados pela equipe de pesquisa, pelo investigador, nas visitas, pelo subinvestigador, pela coordenadora de pesquisa, pela farmacêutica, pelo farmacêutico, ou seja, por todas as pessoas que estão delegadas no estudo. Então, entre o participante de pesquisa, né, e os dados, eu tenho sempre um intermediário. Esse intermediário é a equipe de pesquisa que faz a sua atuação dentro de um centro de pesquisa. Então, esse é o modelo tradicional, a figura do intermediário. Num outro extremo, eu tenho um modelo totalmente virtual. né? Ou seja, eu não tenho a figura do intermediário, não existe o paciente ir num centro de pesquisa. O próprio paciente ou participante, né, como a gente usa o termo mais atual, seria participante, ele fica sabendo do projeto de pesquisa, ele mesmo pode fornecer o consentimento por alguma via eletrônica, ele mesmo pode se auto-incluir no estudo e muitos dados são coletados diretamente por ele, né? Ele manda dados, um device coleta dados de forma automatizada, eventualmente se eu tenho algumas coletas, por exemplo, de exames, isso pode ser feito no próprio domicílio do paciente, ou seja, eu tiro o estudo clínico do centro de pesquisa e levo para casa do participante. É a mesma coisa, antigamente a gente queria ver um filme, né, para o final de semana, a gente ia numa locadora de vídeo, alugava um DVD, alugava uma fita VHS e levava para casa, né, alguém lá nos ajudava a escolher e a gente assistia. Hoje eu não preciso sair da minha casa, eu posso entrar numa plataforma como um Netflix, um Amazon Prime, alguma coisa assim, e escolher o filme que eu quero ver. Antigamente eu queria fazer uma transferência para alguém, eu ia num banco, numa agência bancária, pedir ajuda do caixa, pedir ajuda para o gerente. Hoje, no meu aplicativo, no telefone, eu posso fazer isto. E a pesquisa clínica está indo também para esse modelo mais virtual. E, na verdade, né, o mundo não é tão preto e branco assim, estudos tradicionais e estudos descentralizados. Na verdade, existe uma escala de cinza, não preto e branco. Então, num espectro, eu tenho aquele modelo completamente descentralizado, quer dizer, todos os procedimentos do estudo são conduzidos de forma virtual e isso é permitido, ou seja, é enabled, né, pela tecnologia digital, por wearables, por aplicativos, por telemedicina, né? Eu consigo entregar, por exemplo, produto investigacional na própria casa do paciente, os wearables fazem mensurações, né? Obviamente, nem todas as condições a gente consegue fazer tudo de forma descentralizada. E, obviamente, num outro espectro aqui, eu tenho um modelo completamente tradicional, que é aquilo que a gente já falou, tudo é feito num centro de pesquisa, num hospital, por uma equipe, por um intermediário. E no meio caminho, nós vamos ver alguns exemplos, talvez hoje o que seja mais comum é a gente ter modelos híbridos, né? A gente ter estudos pragmáticos, onde alguns procedimentos, às vezes até a randomização, inclusão, identificação dos pacientes, ou alguns exames são feitos no centro de pesquisa, pela complexidade, pela natureza dos mesmos, mas alguns outros procedimentos são descentralizados, muitos dados podem ser coletados de forma descentralizada, de todas essas formas que a gente viu. Então, a palavra descentralizado, ela é literalmente tirar o intermediário, tirar o centro de pesquisa. Pensem no exemplo que eu dei novamente da locadora de DVDs ou da agência bancária. Eu tiro a locadora, eu tiro a agência bancária. Eu faço as operações da minha casa. Eu escolho o filme que eu quero ver numa plataforma de streaming. Então, o paciente, ele vira o dono da festa, né? O participante vira o centro. Eu não vou, obviamente, falar todo esse slide complicado, mas vem que se a gente olhar, por exemplo, o modelo de um estudo descentralizado, o que está aqui no meio é principalmente o participante. Então, é a partir dele que se criam todas as outras ferramentas, tá? Eu vou parar agora de compartilhar. Eu vou mudar para inglês para a gente chamar o nosso palestrante internacional. So I'll now switch to English after this very brief introduction about the concept, of course, in a very generic way, of decentralized clinical trials and hybrid virtual trials. And tonight we have the privilege to have a friend, a great partner of our team here at Einstein, Dr. Mikhail Kosiborod. Dr. Mikhail Kosiborod is a very well-known clinical trialist. He's a cardiologist, and he's currently the vice-president of research at the St. Luke's Health System in Kansas City, United States. Mikhail Kosiborod has chaired very important trials and has been part of the executive committee of very important cardiovascular trials. He has publications in all the high impact journals like New England Journal of Medicine, Lancet, JAMA, all the top cardiology journals, and he's very well known in the field of clinical research. Dr. Mikhail will present us today two vivid examples of hybrid virtual trials or of trials which had decentralized features. And he was part of the, he was part of the executive committee of this trial. So one trial was the CHIEF-HF trial, which was a trial looking at an SGLT2 inhibitor for patients with heart failure, which was conducted virtually by his institution. And another very good example, and that's why we are discussing this example, is the EVOLVE-MI trial. And this is a trial which Mikhail Kosiborod is one of the study co-chairs, but this study is led by Mikhail and Chris Cannon together with 3 AROs and 3 institutions. One of them is here in Brazil, the ARO Einstein, together with our big data and our innovation team, but also in Sweden by the Uppsala Clinical Research Team, and in the US by the CPC ARO. So Mikhail, the floor is yours. Thanks very much for making the time to be with us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Otavio. Just making sure you can hear me and you can see my slides.
We can hear you well and we can see your slides. Thank you.
Fabulous. Well, first of all, Otavio, many thanks to you and ARO Einstein for a very kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to spend time with you and your colleagues. And we've really enjoyed a wonderful collaboration, especially over the past few years in many areas. And I think, frankly, our ability to work together and what we've been able to produce and are working on currently is really a great model for academic collaborations in the clinical trial space. So as you asked me, I will concentrate today on 2 recent examples. One of a trial that was just recently completed, CHIEF-HF, and presented and published in the past few months, and then EVOLVE-MI that just got underway, because I think there are a number of important themes that they share, especially when it comes to this concept of decentralized trials. Here are my disclosures reflecting leadership in clinical trials. And I will start by the concept, this concept of decentralized trials or more patient-centered trials is really not all that new. Actually, if you look at Institute of Medicine, so we have this institution in the United States that's called Institute of Medicine that looks at complex issues in healthcare and puts together these reports. And actually, there was a report from Institute of Medicine going back 10 years ago in 2012 that centered on envisioning a transformed clinical trials enterprise in the US. And of course, it's not just pertinent to the United States, it's pertinent all over the world. And one of the things that that Institute of Medicine report highlighted is that the ways that the clinical trials were being conducted was not optimal. They were, and still are, very expensive, and they take a very long time period to recruit patients. One of the reasons that they're very expensive and take a long time is that the recruitment rates, especially in the United States, tend to be relatively low. And also patient retention is typically not the best in the world. And it also, the ways the trials are being conducted is inconvenient to patients. So they're not very patient-centric or patient-centered. And the fact that there are multiple requirements on patients' time and inconvenience, that represents a barrier to patient willingness to participate. And if the patients are not willing or not able to come for study visits, it results in missed visits and protocol deviations and creates a number of problems. So going back 10 years ago, there was already kind of this framework to say, maybe we should rethink about how we do clinical trials and how we do the operations of clinical trials in particular. And so that's been an evolution for some time. And then, of course, we had the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic really changed everything because we had to very rapidly shift in the clinical trials world from the way we used to do things to the way things now are. And instead of taking years for that transformation to occur, it had to happen within days and weeks. And it's very interesting. Again, I will transition to the example of CHIEF-HF first, but it so happens that CHIEF-HF was actually planned and designed to be a completely virtual trial but it was planned and designed during about 6 months before the pandemic declaration actually occurred. So we did not know at the time we designed the studies that the pandemic was going to happen, but it's a great example of what can actually happen when you have a trial that's fully virtual right in the middle of a pandemic. So the idea behind Chief-HF from a clinical standpoint was relatively straightforward. We know that the treatment goals in heart failure are to make patients live longer and stay out of the hospital, but also enable patients to feel better and be able to do more. So essentially have an impact on symptoms, functional status, and quality of life. And we have a good tool to collect information about patients' health status, which is the Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire, or KCCQ, that was developed by my colleague John Spurgis right here in Kansas City at our institution. At the time, we had a drug that was already established as the medications that can effectively prevent heart failure in people with diabetes. And we already had data from other SGLT2 inhibitor trials of dapagliflozin and empagliflozin, where we knew that they can be effective in treating heart failure. But that specific question was not yet addressed for canagliflozin. And so the research question was very simple for Chief-HF, which is, does canagliflozin improve symptoms, function, quality of life in patients with heart failure after 12 weeks of treatment? And we already had other traditional trials that have addressed that question with other SGLT2 inhibitors. So we didn't want to just repeat what other trials have done before this one. We wanted to try to innovate in the clinical trial space. So what we decided to do is to design a fully virtual trial again before the pandemic even happened. And in order to do that, we had to develop this computerized phenotype to be able to screen patients. So the inclusion criteria were essentially based on a computerized phenotype that was developed based on EHR review. And there were different criteria for patients with reduced ejection fraction and preserved ejection fraction in terms of the requirements that had to be in electronic health records for them to qualify. Patients had to have sole access to certain types of technology, including iPhone 6 or later versions, or Samsung S7, Galaxy S7 or later version. They had to be willing to wear a Fitbit, Versa 2 version of Fitbit. And they had to have a screening Kansas City Cardiomyopathy Questionnaire, or KCCQ, overall summary score of less than 80. So we wanted to make sure that patients are symptomatic, because KCCQ became the primary endpoint in that study. And the reason KCCQ was the primary endpoint, because it's a meaningful endpoint. It also can be virtually collected. And the exclusion criteria were pretty standard for SGLT2 inhibitor trials: either concurrent use, history of diabetic ketoacidosis, type 1 diabetes, or GFR less than 30. Now, I'm going to go over briefly how we conducted Chief-HF, but I want to tell you that after the trial was designed, it just so happened that the trial was launched the same week as the US went on a full shutdown due to COVID-19. So the study was launched in late March of 2020. And it wasn't planned that way, but it just happened that way. So when you see the results, you need to keep in mind that as this study was launched, almost every other trial of patients with heart failure was being frozen in the US because of the pandemic. So the beauty of Chief-HF was, especially when it comes to pandemic, is that the sites could screen patients completely remote using electronic medical record. And the patients were invited to participate in the trial by email, patient portal through the electronic health record, phone, or potentially there was an opportunity to do it at a visit, but actually no patient visits happened. Everything was being done remotely because of the pandemic. Patients that were invited were then asked to go to a website to learn about the trial. And once they went to the website and they read about the trial on the website, if they were interested, they could opt to be screened right there on the website. If the patients after screening were found to be eligible, they downloaded the app, and then they could be consented by the e-consent that was obtained by the principal investigator or a study coordinator. And that consent was documented using this regulatory compliant app. The study medications and a Fitbit were then delivered to the patient by mail. So again, no contact with the patient, no study visits. And the patients then, depending on whether they got randomized to the drug or placebo, they took the study medication for 12 weeks. And then there was an additional 6 months follow-up. Now, if you have read the Chief HF publication or seen the presentation, you know that we initially planned to enroll 1,900 patients, but we stopped early for administrative reasons after enrolling 476 patients. Now, this had little to do with enrollment. That was actually very good. In fact, our enrollment rate was 4 times faster than a traditional heart failure trial. But what ended up happening is that because of the shifting priorities of the sponsor in the middle of the pandemic and other things that needed to be addressed by the companies that made canagliflozin and still makes canagliflozin, which is Janssen Pharmaceuticals, a part of Johnson & Johnson, they decided to shift their priorities elsewhere, and they were no longer interested in potentially pursuing registration for canagliflozin for the indication of heart failure. And so it was purely an administrative decision, did not have anything to do with the underlying science or with the trial itself, really. Now, I want to tell you that as we were doing the study, it was so innovative that actually made it into local news. And I will temporarily stop sharing and reshare a different screen, and I will show you this movie here, and let me know if you can hear it and see it.
I would have to take about 3 steps and stop and catch my breath and just breathe in deep breaths.
That's 69-year-old Anna Meadows describing what it's like to live with diastolic heart failure. There was no treatment. Then, in the middle of a pandemic, she was offered this drug called Invokana, being studied as a treatment for her condition.
And what these drugs do, as somebody's blood sugar goes over a certain threshold, they will actually start to urinate out some of their sugars.
Dr. Michael Nassif with St. Luke's Mid-America Heart Institute is working on a study called the Chief HF trial. Originally designed to treat diabetes, Invokana had an unexpected benefit for patients with heart failure. Most patients who qualify, though, are high risk for COVID-19. But with this study, they can do everything from home.
It shows my heart rate when I have it on.
Anna received a Fitbit along with the drug. All her information is fed directly to the hospital. The medicine bottle even has a Bluetooth cap so doctors know it's opened every day. It's a double-blind study, but Anna's convinced she's got the actual drug.
I think I do. I think I do, because I have noticed such a significant change in my ability to breathe better.
But I think if this trial works, particularly for congestive heart failure, I think this will be the way majority future trials will go. It would be some component of virtual or 100% virtual.
So let me reshare now my other screen here. Hold on. One second. Okay. So let me go back to where I was. I didn't want to show that because, can you see my slides, Otavio? Okay, perfect. I wanted to show that because at the time, of course, this news reel was done. We didn't know the results of the study yet. It wasn't finished yet, but it kind of shows you that these things definitely garner attention, but it was such an unusual situation in the middle of the pandemic that we had a very successful trial enrolling patients, and their concerns about having to come to a site or to a hospital were non-existent because everything could be done from home. So let me just take you through how the study worked. So again, this was a randomized clinical trial that was completed without any face-to-face visits with the patients. So we approached these patients with a computerized phenotype of reduced or preserved EF heart failure. There was a screening period where they went on the website. Well, first of all, they went on the website, they learned about the study, and then if they were interested, they were consented, and then following consenting, they were screened, including baseline KCCQ if they qualified. They were then randomly assigned to canagliflozin or placebo. The drug was shipped to them, and all of the outcome ascertainment was done remotely. And the primary outcome was KCCQ that was assessed at 12 weeks. And then there was, after finishing the treatment, patients were unblinded, but there was some additional follow-up afterwards. And again, as I said, primary outcome being a patient-reported outcome of Kansas City cardiomyopathy questionnaire. The enrolling site collected patient characteristics, including some baseline demographics and the ejection fraction category, whether they did or did not have diabetes. The study app collected all the outcomes, including Kansas City cardiomyopathy questionnaire, which is the primary outcome, and also self-reported adherence to medications. As you saw, there was this Bluetooth-enabled study medication bottle. And then we used claims data to confirm eligibility, but also to collect serious adverse events and concurrent medications before and after the study. We did have kind of a patient call center as well that could follow up with patients in case they had kind of additional adverse events to report. So how did the trial do? So we screened over 1,300 patients, and about 50% of those patients ultimately consented. So it's not a bad conversion rate for a fully virtual study where there is no face-to-face contact with the patient. Out of those, about 28% did not qualify because they did not have KCCQ in the range that we were looking for. And ultimately, we randomized 476 patients. Out of those, 28 ultimately decided not to participate after they were randomized. And so they either never took a dose of medicine or didn't have any follow-up data. And so the full analysis set was about 448 patients. And you can see that vast majority of those patients continued the study on study medication. What are some other metrics of success? And it just tells you what can be done with good technology in place and appropriate level of dedication of all the team members. So claims validation of heart failure at baseline was in 100% of patients. A drug was delivered directly to patient in 100% of cases. Self-reported medication adherence of 80% or more was in 91% of patients. E-diary compliance of 80% or greater in more than 90%, 95% of patients. KCCQ was collected at the end of study in 98% of patients. And the Fitbit compliance was in 94% of patients. So it was very high metrics, I think, for any study, whether it's decentralized or traditional. So again, that tells you that you can get there with the appropriate level of commitment. So what were the primary results? This is not really relevant for what we're discussing, which is conduct of decentralized trials, but just to show you, those of you that know SGLT2 inhibitor trials and heart failure will recognize that there was actually a similar effect to what we've seen with other medications like dapagliflozin in patients with heart failure. The effect size was comparable, 4.3-point improvement in patients treated with canagliflozin as compared to those treated with placebo, with a significant p-value. So despite the fact that trial was closed early for administrative reasons, we actually had successful trial on the primary endpoint, and also very consistent with what we're seeing in traditional trials. Now, we're talking about decentralized trials. I think it's important to mention that they solve some problems, but they don't solve all problems. And so this shows you variability in site recruitment. So we, as you can see, had 21 sites, and we had huge variability in how many patients the sites were able to recruit. So invites to patients where the range was from 172 patients at one site to 46,000 at another site. Patients screened between 2 and 500, consented between 1 and 400, randomized between 1 and nearly 200 per site. So, it's important to keep in mind that this is not a panacea to all ills that affect clinical trials. You're still going to have variability. You're still going to have good sites and bad sites and intermediate sites. So it certainly solves some problems, but not all of them. And what we found, just like what we find with traditional trials, that targeted portal messages, personal emails, and phone calls was a key to success. And that worked better than mass emails or snail mail. Other pearls kind of acquired during the study. Technology is critical, of course. Ideally, what you want is make it accessible from any smart device, not just certain types of devices, because it, of course, improves generalizability. But we do have evolving platforms that can really successfully collect data and outcomes. Defining data needs is absolutely critical. Make sure you know what you absolutely need and make sure it's collected well. That, again, is similar to what you would see with traditional trials. We did have a virtual patient support center, and we found this to be exceedingly valuable because they were able to troubleshoot any patient technology issues and also be able to connect with patients if there were any issues at all, whether technical or otherwise. And just as in any traditional trials, motivated principal investigators are worth their weight in gold. That does not change. So remember, decentralized trials are not the same as siteless trials. You still, for decentralized trials, you still need a team of people to be able to recruit patients. So that kind of concludes Chief HF, and I'm just going to shift to Evolve, which is Chief has now been, successfully completed, presented, published, and I think lessons learned. Evolve is a trial that we are just launching now, and that's a study that, unlike Chief HF that was done purely in the United States, Evolve is really a trial that's going to be global, and it's certainly to my heart's delight that Brazil is going to be a key country in Evolve-MI, and Albert Einstein, ARO, is our partner in Brazil to make sure we are successful with the study. So again, the clinical question in Evolve-MI is, I think, a very straightforward question. We know that PCSK9 inhibitors and avelumab reduces aterothrombotic events in patients with atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. We know that from prior trials, but those prior trials excluded patients with acute coronary syndrome, a population that's arguably is at the highest risk of recurrent events. And traditional randomized clinical trials of PCSK9 inhibitors selected very specific patient populations and required optimal treatment at baseline, which we know is infrequently achieved in real-world practice. And therefore, it's possible that both the absolute and maybe even relative risk reductions that we've seen with PCSK9 inhibitors may have been underestimated. As a result, they're almost never used in patients with acute coronary syndrome, even in the United States, where these medications are a bit more easily available than other parts of the world. But it's about 1% of patients that are typically treated with these medicines after an acute myocardial infarction. So that led, of course, to our hypothesis that we are testing in Evolve-MI, which is a large outcome trial testing whether avelumab early in acute coronary syndrome at the time of hospitalization or shortly afterwards, within a few days, can be effective in reducing important outcomes in this patient population. The primary endpoint, as you will see, is a composite of total events of myocardial infarction, ischemic stroke, arterial revascularization, and death from any cause. So 4,000 patients overall, 2,000 randomized to avelumab, 2,000 to routine clinical care. There is no placebo in this trial. And it's an event-driven trial with estimated median follow-up of about 3.5 years. So it was important for us to study these questions that's highly clinically relevant, but it was also an opportunity to innovate and figure out how can we do the study on a relatively limited budget and use the technologies that we can have available to us today to really set an example of how to do a pragmatic, partially decentralized or hybrid trial, so that we don't just answer a clinical question, but we also set an example of how to do trials just like this one, both in this disease area and other disease areas successfully using these pragmatic and decentralized features. So we saw it as an opportunity to innovate, and I'll mention just some of those innovative approaches that we're using in Evolve-MI. These include simple one-step inclusion. So essentially, the study coordinators or PIs only have to attest that patient meets all of the inclusion, none of the exclusion criteria, and then they can enroll the patient without having to check multiple boxes. Also, the inclusion-exclusion criteria are extremely streamlined so that almost any patient with ACS can qualify. There is a direct drug distribution to patient. And that is planned for all of the countries that will be involved, which is US, Brazil, and Sweden. With, again, Albert Einstein ARO leading this trial in Brazil. So the same as what we did in Chief HF, focused data collection, follow-up surveys being sent directly to participants, just like what we did in Chief HF, direct communication to a patient, streamlined safety collection. This is a completely virtual trial after the initial contact with the patient during index hospitalization, local adjudication and quality control, and direct data extraction from electronic medical record. There is also streamlined independent safety committee review that happens here as well. So everything that can be streamlined will be streamlined, and everything that can be virtualized will be virtualized. And so kind of a big picture concept here is that patients are hospitalized with acute MI, they're approached for potential participation, and if they consent, and they're eligible and they consent, they are randomized and hopefully get their first dose in a hospital or shortly after discharge, irrespective of most other characteristics, irrespective of their LDL levels. And then after that, they stay on either a medication or a standard of care, depending what they get randomized to. And there aren't any in-person, face-to-face visits. There is passive data collection as well as proactive surveys. If there is a potential for a serious adverse event or an outcome event, that study coordinator or PI can contact the patient by phone to get some additional information. The LDL-C collection following the randomization in most patients is going to be in a local laboratory and according to a standard of care, and the drug resupply is done through direct delivery to the patient. So that trial is being launched. We call it Evolve MI because we're evolving our understanding of when and where PCSK9 inhibitors can be effective, but also our understanding on how to innovate in the clinical trial space. So similar to what Otavia started with, it's important to keep in mind that there is a spectrum of decentralized trials. The trials can be fully decentralized or fully centralized, but there is also a hybrid approach where you can have anything in between. And the right answer for a given trial it's that it's really all depends. It depends on the trial, right? So it depends on the questions that you're asking. So to kind of conclude, decentralized trials are a reality. They're here to stay. Greater decentralization of most trials is likely the future, as well as greater use of digital technology over time. The promise of these technologies are rapid patient enrollment or more rapid patient enrollment, more rapid study completion, more convenient to patients, ability to collect additional data elements compared to traditional trials. But it's important to keep in mind that one size does not fit all. As always, approach should be tailored to the clinical questions that's being addressed. So with that, Otavia, I will close. And again, many thanks for inviting me to share some time with you today.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Fantastic and very inspiring talk. And we are proud to launch the Evolve trial here in Brazil, where we expect to have a huge contribution. So I'll switch back to Portuguese e vou voltar para você, Camila, para a gente continuar o evento.
Obrigada, doutor Otávio. Bom, pessoal, a gente trouxe, o doutor Otávio, o doutor Mikhail trouxeram toda a contextualização, né, do que é estudo clínico descentralizado e cases práticos, né, de como que isso tem acontecido. Mas na medida em que os estudos clínicos eles passam por esse momento de transformação digital, digamos assim, existe todo um cuidado que precisa ter para que esses dados gerados a partir, né, desse monitoramento remoto, desse recrutamento remoto, eles estejam organizados e passíveis de serem analisados com maior cuidado. E para trazer um pouquinho do que existe de necessidade, né, em relação a essa estrutura para essa análise e obtenção desses dados, o Dr. Edson Amaro vai falar um pouquinho para a gente. Dr. Edson?
Bom, boa noite, gente. Essa ideia, né, que surgiu, e acho que todos nós aqui estamos entendendo que é uma ideia que é muito tecnológica, ela requer algumas modificações nos processos de coleta de dados, que também ficaram claros nas apresentações, não vou repetir isso, mas vou comentar alguns pontos que são fundamentais, né? Existe uma visão que está implícita em tudo que a gente falou aqui, que é usar ferramentas de cloud, de nuvem, né? E eu vou fazer 2 comentários sobre isso. Primeiro, que você tem hoje os serviços de nuvem, em vários aspectos podem ser usados, então os grandes provedores podem ser utilizados, mas existem questões de segurança e privacidade de dados que a gente precisa ser endereçados. Inclusive porque a gente está usando meios, né, de comunicar os dados que precisam estar aderentes aos protocolos de pesquisa, inclusive as condições que os pacientes assinam, né, quando estão acionando as ferramentas de um estudo descentralizado. Então, os pontos de cuidado principais que eu gostaria de chamar a atenção é que existe todo um elo de fluxo de dados, então a jornada dos dados precisa ser mapeada em relação à Lei Geral de Proteção de Dados e às condições apresentadas para os participantes de estudo. Então, lembrando aí que não são suficientes somente, né, as condições da legislação do país, mas também aquelas específicas do estudo, né, que frequentemente é um processo importantíssimo que traz confiança para o participante e o processo inteiro deve ser também avaliado, né, do ponto de vista de criar uma condição que facilite a aderência. Então, quais são os pontos de cuidado? Esse primeiro que eu comuniquei, né, que existe uma cadeia de caminhos por onde o dado trafega. Novamente, existe participação de ferramentas de nuvem. Tem algumas questões que a gente pode falar um pouquinho para frente sobre custos disso. Se eu estou lidando com waveforms, que são dados, né, dos seus vestíveis, eles têm uma alta densidade, dependendo do seu estudo. Isso pode ser um desejo, mas não atingível. Então, talvez a gente tenha que pensar sempre em dimensão de dados, uma questão tecnológica. E uma que acho que é muito fácil da gente entender é que uma vez que eu monte uma estrutura dessa, ela tem que dar, como já foi falado pelo Otávio e foi falado pelo Mikhail, ela tem que dar suporte ao paciente do ponto de vista de favorecer a aderência, garantir que ele realmente esteja atendido e novamente, dar uma visibilidade de onde está o estudo, né? Então, são elementos gráficos, aí eu estou falando mais do lado da inovação, de quem desenvolve a interface, que são fundamentais para a aderência, consubstanciar a confiança do paciente e garantir, em última análise, a qualidade de dados. Uma característica dos Descentralizados Clinical Trials, que muitas vezes as ferramentas que a gente utiliza, tipicamente em adoção de ferramentas de tecnologia digital, podem ser incluídas, né? A gente tem que pensar quais são os desafios para isso. Por exemplo, se eu incluir gamification, né, a ideia de você entender como você está em relação a outros, ainda é mal conhecido os efeitos num estudo de pesquisa do tipo que a gente pretende fazer, como o Evolve, né? Então, quais elementos a gente poderia incorporar em Descentralizados Clinical Trials? É um desafio. Não sabemos quais seriam os efeitos desses elementos e, principalmente, qual a visão do paciente sobre isso. Acho que um conceito muito legal é o paciente agora também pode perceber que ele pode doar, né, os seus dados para a geração de conhecimento com muito mais facilidade. Então, talvez a gente crie agora uma condição diferente do ponto de vista, né, do paciente. Então, não apenas a ideia que você tem que cuidar da jornada de dados, de quais elementos eu posso incorporar na interface, né, no front-end de contato com o paciente, da responsabilidade, né, da segurança de dados, que a gente comentou, das leis gerais de proteção de dados. Tem também o elemento de descoberta. Esse estudo é muito novo, a gente não sabe ainda quanto a gente consegue engajar o paciente e criar uma cultura de participar de pesquisa num país, né? Isso deve traspassar todas as camadas sociais, né? A ideia também de você ver o efeito ao longo das matizes, né, do nosso tecido social também é muito bacana, que você pode explorar, porque você não tem barreiras geográficas ou qualquer outra. Inclusive, vamos considerar alguns números que saíram agora, mais recentes, da nossa pesquisa de porcentagem ou frequência de população que acessa, não é só que tem, mas que acessa soluções baseadas em ferramentas digitais com seus smartphones. Hoje o Brasil ultrapassou 84% da população que tem smartphones. Não é só ter um celular, mas isso para a gente é uma base fantástica de contato com o paciente que é explorada, por exemplo, com tecnologia de Decentralized Clinical Trials. Então, acho que são os elementos para a gente conversar daqui a pouco, mas tem muita coisa nova para fazer. É um cenário novo, desafiador, e por trás disso está todo o conceito de Pragmatic Clinical Trials, que envolvem qualidade de dado, e, em última análise, as inter-relações, que são as variáveis latentes, são desafios, né, para a gente cuidar quando a gente faz análise desses dados, mas é óbvio, tudo passa pelo velho e bom desenho e a boa pergunta que vai guiar todo o nosso processo aqui. Acho que eu vou parar aqui de comentário e vamos abrir espaço para a gente conversar um pouco mais. Obrigado aí pelo convite I'm sorry, Mikhail, for the Portuguese speaking, but as you imagine, I have nothing new to you. And so let's hear what are the questions from the audience. Obrigado, gente. Passo de volta agora a bola para a nossa moderadora Camila aqui.
Bom, pessoal, antes da gente ir para as perguntas, eu já vi que tem várias aqui no chat. Só um comentário, doutor Edson. O doutor Edson trouxe toda essa visão dessa estrutura que precisa ser montada, né, para que esse tipo de estudo ele aconteça de uma forma segura e de uma forma que os resultados sejam positivos. E aqui tem justamente uma oportunidade, que são para as pequenas empresas, né? E aí, até falando um pouco da nossa experiência, né? A gente contando aqui, não sei se todos sabem, mas no final do ano passado, o Einstein criou um Centro de Estudos Clínicos Descentralizados, que é composto justamente pela diretoria da Academic Research Organization, representada pelo Dr. Otávio, pela diretoria do Big Data, representada aqui pelo Dr. Edson, e pela diretoria de inovação, Rodrigo Demar, que não pode estar aqui com a gente, e juntos a gente tenta criar essa estrutura para que esses estudos clínicos descentralizados aconteçam da melhor forma. E onde é que entra a inovação nisso, né? Justamente trazendo essas tecnologias que podem dar suporte a esse tipo de estudo. Então, aqui tem uma oportunidade para as startups, por exemplo, bem interessante, porque a solução delas, que nem foram desenhadas para esse tipo de estudo, elas podem ser facilmente aplicadas. E aí eu estou falando de devices que permitem, por exemplo, a realização de exames remotos, aplicativos que permitem a captura de dados e o engajamento de pacientes. Então, tem uma série de oportunidades que a gente vem tentando falar para as startups para ficarem atentas, porque são diversos os estudos que podem ser realizados, né, multidisciplinares, e que, da mesma forma, pode trazer não apenas uma empresa para um trial desse, mas várias outras empresas acopladas num único estudo. Então, é só para chamar a atenção que a gente tem bastante startups aqui na audiência, e que para elas ficarem atentas também, que não é só a grande indústria, né, que vê benefícios nesse tipo de estudo, mas também tem oportunidade para essas empresas nascentes. Eu vou começar aqui, vou trazer a primeira pergunta. O Danilo perguntou como é que ele consegue medir a qualidade de um ensaio descentralizado. Se há uma diretriz para o relato e quais seriam as limitações mais comuns?
Yes, let me translate this question to Mikhail and Edson, feel free to jump in. I can also complement Camila. Danilo asks, how can we critically appraise and measure the methodological quality of decentralized trials? Is there a specific tool, or what are the extra features that we should look for when critically appraising a decentralized trial?
Well, I mean, my take on it, I would say, Otávio, Edson, Camila, please chime in, if you agree or disagree. But I think if we're to succeed with this approach, we have to apply similar metrics as what we apply to traditional trials, right? I mean, if these trials are going to be used for registration of new drugs and devices, for example, then they need to be competitive in terms of the usual metrics that we use to evaluate whether the trials are successful or not. How many patients successfully completed the trial? How many patients completed the trial on study medication? What was the adherence to study medication during the study? How many patients withdrew consent or were lost to follow-up? How many have available vital status? And how confident are we in outcome ascertainment? These kind of things are what we look for in traditional trials to give us confidence that the data that we're seeing, the results, can be relied upon. So if there is no confidence in the results, then what's the point of doing the trial to begin with, right? I mean, it's meaningless, right? So we have to be sure. I don't see decentralized trials as a somehow substitution for mediocre quality, which say, well, we don't want to spend. So first of all, let me say this. Don't think necessarily, at least at this point, don't think that decentralized trials are less expensive automatically than traditional trials are. maybe there will be one day, but it doesn't necessarily follow that because you're doing decentralized trials, it's going to be less expensive. It may be, or it may not be, right? So that's number one. Number two is, if we go with a pragmatic or decentralized approach, we can say, well, we are compromising on these things, and so it's going to be a mediocre quality trial. No, that's not the point. The point is that we're doing things that are more convenient for the patients. We're doing things that can improve enrollment and potentially retention of patients. We're doing things because we think we can collect additional data or collect data in a different ways that's better, right? The idea is to do things better, not to do them, not to compromise quality, right? So ultimately, if this enterprise is going to succeed, it's got to be very high quality. So I think the metrics should be similar metrics. As I showed you in Chief, for example, I mean, we had, 95% or something like that had, outcome ascertained at the end of 12 weeks. That was the very first try, right? That's not the last decentralized trial. It's one of the first that we did. I believe it's the first in heart failure that I'm aware of. So that's my take on it. I think it's, compromising on quality or compromising on metrics is not the way to go.
Yeah, no, perfect. Camila, I think since we have a lot of questions, maybe we can address others. I think Mikhail's answer was complete.
Ok. A próxima...
Go ahead, Edson.
Não, Camila. Vai adiante.
A próxima pergunta é da Camila Abreu, e ela pergunta quais tipos de perguntas de pesquisa não seriam aplicáveis para realizar um estudo descentralizado. E ela pede alguns exemplos.
So Camila, Mikhail, and Edson, she's asking us, are there any research questions where decentralized trials would not be applicable or would not be possible? Can you provide some examples for that?
Yeah, to me, I mean, there are probably a few examples. Maybe I will start and, Edson and Camila can add. But to me, a critical question is, what are you testing and where is this drug or device is in its natural kind of evolution? And I would say early in the development process, I don't think that decentralized trials are quite ready for doing, I don't think they're ready for doing kind of phase 1 type studies. I think when you have a drug where you don't even understand the safety profile really well yet, doing something decentralized where you have more limited access to a patient, it's probably not the place where I would start. I mean, the beautiful thing about, Chief HF, and Evolve MI is you're dealing with drugs that have extremely well-established safety profile. You know exactly what to expect. It's highly unlikely that anything new is going to come on the safety side of things. It's highly unlikely that a patient is going to develop some terrible side effects that you don't know about. Because so many patients have already been studied in traditional trials. So I think it's great right now for life cycle management. I'm not sure that it's yet, it's prime time to start doing, phase 1, phase 2 trials. And I think for, phase 3 pivotal trials, the registration for first indication, there's probably a time where you can start introducing some decentralized elements. I'm not sure that doing fully decentralized trial when so much is riding on it, I don't think we're quite there yet. But lifecycle management, I think it's a perfect time to start doing things like this.
Yeah. And maybe so go ahead, sorry.
Perhaps I'll say it in English and then quickly,
because
just to boost the question. I think it's a very broad question, but we should think about the type of patients we want to access for obvious reasons. Sometimes we will get answers not directly from the patient, so this wouldn't be essentially a decentralized clinical trials to the point that we're looking directly to the patient. But when you're talking to caregivers, so the impression that the caregiver has from the patient might not be ideal. So sometimes you need a medical professional to interview a patient. So psychiatric conditions, a few conditions might also be a problem. And of course, depending on where you want to make some, let's say, when you've made someone to assess certain type of conditions, and then there's no technical access to the kind of tools that we need, then definitely, by definition, you're not able to do it. In other words, to very fragile populations that you want to include in your trials, they don't have access to technology. This, of course, it's a basic impediment. So I went to these 3 points. Definitely, there might be future solutions for those. But at this point, these are kind of obvious reasons why we will not have access to the patients. So towards the patient, let's say, bias, I think we might have some limitations as well, not only the concept that is proposed, but also to get in touch with the data related to patients' reality. So some indirect information might also be useful, but not as well as by direct assessment by the medical professional.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly add that I think that's an evolving it's an evolving concept. So first of all, it's not black and white, it's more like shades of gray. It's a continuum. So even sometimes I believe that even for newer drugs, or for example, for complex diseases, for example, trials in oncology and or hematology, where you need features of precision medicine, you need fancy imaging, you know. Of course, some things will need to be conducted at the sites, but at the same time, some procedures can be collected virtually. For example, patient-reported outcomes, some use of some wearables, and things like that. So I think more and more, even for registration trials, it's not a rule. I do agree, and it's not easy. It requires a shifting of mindset from, you know, regulators and authorities. But I think, for example, in the US, you are in a good position because you now have Robert Califf, the FDA commissioner, and he is probably one of the greatest enthusiasts of pragmatic decentralized trials. So I think more and more we'll see at least some hybrid trials and some decentralized features, even in some registration trials. Camila, I think we also have some, Mikhail and Edson, just for you to know, we can also, if someone would like to join us and ask a question directly, we can invite them. So I think we have Ari Osvaldo here.
Yeah, and just to quickly add very, very quickly, Otávio, to what you said, I fully agree, by the way. I think it's time to start introducing various decentralized concepts, even in registration trials, and maybe even in some phase 2 trials. Early in development process. So as I said, and you pointed out as well, it's not, you know, it's not cut and dry. It's not one or the other. There could be all kinds of hybrids. You know, the more we start introducing these concepts, the faster we learn how to do it well.
Yeah, it's a high flexibility.
Acho que o Arisvaldo, muito bem-vindo. Boa noite. Se você quiser falar em português ou inglês, fica à vontade, gente. Como você
Okay. Good evening to everyone. Congratulations on the lecture. I have 2 questions, one for the Dr. Mikhail and another for the Dr. Otávio and Edson. First, what would be needed to conduct a decentralized clinical trial in the case of a new therapy without regulation by regulatory agencies? I mean, in the case of Brazil, where Anvisa has no regulation for the new therapy, and clinical studies would be necessary to be able to lead to the creation of this regulation. This is my first question to directly Dr. Mikhail. And for the Dr. Otávio, are there any examples of decentralized clinical trials conducted in Brazil in the case of Albert Einstein?
Thank you.
Yeah, no,
maybe Mikhail can start and I can follow. And Edson too.
Okay.
Thank you, Ari Osvaldo.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the question. So I can tell you, in the US, there is a willingness from the regulators to start looking at these concepts. And frankly, you know, the idea was when we started Chief that we would potentially go that route. There are lots of other things that happen kind of outside of our controls that ultimately, you know, it did not pan out that way. But nevertheless, I think the regulators are more than willing to have conversations upfront about these types of approaches. I mean, they want to make sure the data is reliable, as you can imagine, and they want to make sure there are appropriate systems in place to ensure high data quality. And the systems that they use to collect data, have to comply with the regulations. But there is a way to do that and still do some of the things that I described. So I think we're in the beginning of this journey, and their thinking is evolving rapidly. But I think there is a lot of openness from, at least in the US side of things. Now, Otávio, you know better than I in Brazil, so I'll let you address that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Osvaldo. When, of course, you as well, I mean, you said perfectly, we don't have a regulation from Anvisa. In terms of regulação, we don't have a regulation. But I think when I approached them about these things, and people on Anvisa said the same thing that Mikhail just commented, which is it depends a lot on the data quality, right? How reliable they are, or if you can provide us with the metrics of data quality. It's not, I mean, they are not against you doing it, but of course, they'll have to measure all the standards, all the metrics equally as how they measure a traditional trial. So I think more and more you'll see the trials. It's the same example that I did. I did an example in the beginning saying that a couple of years ago, we used to go to Blockbuster and take a VHS tape or a DVD. Now we use Netflix, and we used to go to our bank to talk to our manager. Now we use our smartphone. So I think technology is evolving. We are not there yet, but is evolving. I think there are not many examples in Brazil. But in terms of Einstein, I think our main example is exactly the last study that Dr. Mikhail presented, which is the Evolve MI trial, which is a collaborative study with Amgen, and that includes, of course, an executive committee. Mikhail is one of the co-chairs, but we have 3 AROs leading the study. Here in Brazil is ARO Einstein, and here in Brazil is not just our ARO, our innovation team and Edson's team, Big Data are deeply involved with that. So it's our decentralized team, actually, at Einstein. But we also have CPC Research, which is an ARO from the US, and also Uppsala Clinical Research, which is an ARO from Sweden. So it's 3 countries, and I think that's going to be the largest example currently in Brazil of a hybrid trial.
So
Yeah.
one advice, what would be your advice on how I can show this data, this high quality data? I have this data, and how can I show this for example, Anvisa to have this regulation, have access, or maybe Albert Einstein, don't know.
I think if you use similar metrics to what Mikhail just presented in the Chief HF trial, and you align with them in advance, I think that will be my advice. But always you need to align with them in advance.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you. Great questions. Thank you so much.
So the next question is, what about the patient retention in this kind of study?
Yeah, I mean, again, if you look at Chief, which is the best example we have so far with results, the patient retention was quite good, actually. It was comparable to other trials like this. You know, again, it happened during the time where patients actually didn't want to go to a hospital. So it provided an ability to participate in the trial without having face-to-face contact. Patients appreciated it very much because that's exactly what they wanted at the time. We see as the pandemic recedes in the background that some patients want face-to-face contact, they actually, you know, miss it. And so for some patients, you know, face-to-face contact is fine. But for many others, I mean, I can tell you, I imagine same may be true in Sao Paulo, but here in Kansas City, we have hundreds of thousands of patients that we have in our health systems that live more than 2 hours away by car. Yeah, so, you know, and as you probably know, gas is getting very expensive. So, you know, it gives an opportunity for people to be engaged with their hospital or their health systems that they really trust and want to contribute to research, but without undue burden on both time and financial burden too, to be honest. So, I mean, we found the patient retention, at least in this very first example that we did a fully decentralized trial, was very comparable to what we see in traditional trials. So it was not a big difference.
I think there's someone Mikhail, here that had just joined us to ask a question.
Yes, I've seen this guy before.
Go ahead,
hours ago.
Yeah, go ahead, Remo.
So good evening to everybody. It's a real pleasure to see this very nice talk. So my question is, in Mikhail, for your perspective, and also for Otávio and Edson. So in a country like Brazil, with a lot of people from low-income environment, how could we handle this? Those devices and apps to be available to those people, how can they have access to smartphones, even if they are not so used to it, to collect data?
Right. So, I mean, it's definitely an obstacle in low middle income countries. It's frankly an obstacle to some extent in the US, not necessarily because of device availability. It is certainly that we have many low income individuals as well that may not be able to afford the device. But it's a bigger issue is really older generation having kind of difficulty with technology in general. And of course, we want the trials to be generalizable. So it is, it is an issue. We were even more limited in Chief because not only did people have to have a device, but they had to have a certain type of device. So lots and lots of people that got excluded because their smart device model was not compatible with the technologies that we had. So ultimately, if these things are going to be proliferating and successful, technology has to evolve, and it will evolve. We need to make sure that there are apps that can be that can live on a variety of different platforms, variety of different devices. Hopefully can be installed and work well regardless of the platform or device that the patient may have, as long as they have some type of a smart device with Wi-Fi access. And they're also becoming less expensive. You don't necessarily need to have the latest and greatest model of iPhone, that costs $1,000. You can find devices that are very inexpensive and can be potentially quite cost effective in terms of just providing it to patients, shipping it to patients that may potentially be interested, because the cost of the device is potentially negligible compared to the savings that you can realize potentially, depending on what kind of a trial you're talking about. So these are very valid issues, Remo, and I would say it's probably one of the biggest issues right now is making sure that we have trials that don't exclusively enroll patients that are technology savvy and have money to buy an expensive device. In order for it to be successful, it has to be universal and nearly universally available. But we all know that technologies that used to cost tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars now cost a few $100s, and those that used to be a few $100s now could be just a few dollars, years later. So it'll continue to evolve.
Edson, I think you have a good example with in big data, even in low-income population, pregnant women, and can you comment?
Yeah, I just posted on the chat here a link to the latest information related to the Brazilian performance using devices in healthcare. Actually, just to give you a more direct view, page 23 and 24. So there you will see how Brazilians have been using technology to access telehealth services overall during the pandemic, and that has been a boom. And I'll just give you one example. It's straightforward. It compares different socioeconomical classes, and so the number of users from internet for specifically those with 16 years old or more, actually it's around 30%. And these are the people that had a medical consultation with another professional or a medical doctor. So these guys have used, so 30%, it's quite high. And it's almost the same number across different ages. There is a difference between social class. So Remo, you're very right. So class A and B, it's 42%, compared to class C and DE, which is 20%. So I think that gives a hint about not only those that the number I gave before was the owners of smartphones. Now I'm telling you those that are using smartphones to get in touch with healthcare professionals. So I think we are surprised by those numbers. I wouldn't expect that number, especially in class C and DE, which is still quite high. Again, those numbers do not reflect the spatial heterogeneity, and that has a big bias, which is communication. So the infrastructure for telecommunication in Brazil is still lagging behind. So people, they own their own smartphones, but they don't have enough speed or stability for connect. So we should definitely think about a minimal consumption of bandwidth to achieve those populations that are in most need for infrastructure and communication. So the question is very wise, because then definitely that means we do have to work on how to get around those biases if you're aiming at certain populations. So yeah, this is a challenging thing that might not be the same in all countries. In our country, it's very interesting because even those that in most need, they choose to use that money in technology. I think this is quite surprising. And most people, they perhaps live in a very critical conditions, but they still decide to buy technology. So I think there's a need to understand why is that happening and the influences in behavior anyways. So it's interesting. There's data. I like to point out that the site that I just posted here has done a more comprehensive assess of technology used by Brazilians. But those numbers that I give you, I think they're very specific as a target to guide decentralized clinical trials around this specific problem of technology assessment. Again, we are not in a position that one would imagine that, well, Brazil has a very large number of people that do not have access to goods in society overall. But the choice they made to have communication, perhaps we like to talk like I am doing right now. And so social media is a large part of Brazilian life now. So they do like to use their mobiles to talk. So this is another thing that we have to take into account. Again, these are very important questions. We don't know exactly what is the influence. We have to think about it. And this is a learning process, as we just saw. This will be part of the journey that we started.
Thank you, Edson. Thank you, Remo. Fantastic. Thank you very much.
So we received here several questions regarding the costs of this kind of study. Once we have several technologies here in this context, how this kind of study could be more cheaper than the original clinical trials? How it be possible to reduce costs?
Some things that can be very obvious, right? Which is generally the way things are going is technology is getting less expensive over time, whereas the human contributions and time is getting more expensive over time. So I think the savings come from the fact that ideally, if you design things the right way and technology is designed the right way, it saves time for human beings to do the work that needs to be done because the technology is doing that work for you. So if you can free up the time from human beings and put that onus on technology, and you look at the history of what the costs are, one is definitely going down over time and one is definitely going up over time. So that's where the savings will come in. That doesn't mean that today, as I mentioned before, doesn't mean that today a decentralized trial is going to cost less. It may or may not, depending what the trial is. Some may actually end up costing more, depending on how expensive the technology is. But I think the trend over time is going to be that as technology becomes more affordable and the just sheer reduction in human contribution, study coordinators, all the other study personnel that doesn't have to meet with the patient, spend hours of their time, that can add up quite quickly as well. So that's the most obvious place where I think the savings can eventually come from.
Yeah, and I think savings can also come from, because a lot of decentralized trials, not all of them, but several of them are also aligned with the concept of doing more pragmatic trial with streamlined inclusion criteria, streamlined data collection, and that will translate in, instead of having the traditional site monitoring and which require on-site visits, we could do a lot of the monitoring procedures in a virtual manner on a risk-based model and things like that. And usually site monitoring and things like that usually end up costing like 40% of the labor of a trial. So if we do, of course, a more pragmatic design with streamlined data collection, we'll save money also in terms of still guaranteeing the quality. This is very important. As Mikhail mentioned in the beginning, we are not giving up quality. Quality is not quality is still a top priority for decentralized trials. It's the same thing. We need the metrics, but maybe there are smarter ways and more efficient ways in terms of conducting the trial, especially if you lump together the concepts of a decentralized trial with a pragmatic design. I think that will definitely result in some cost savings, which are important, theoretically, of course.
And the last thing maybe I will add, thank you, Ottavio. It's very, very good point. And the other thing I would add too is, time is money in other ways, which is if this allows you to recruit patients more efficiently, and you spend, a year in recruitment instead of 2 years, that you just saved yourself, lots and lots of money, because, running a trial for another year, would be a fortune, right? Compared, especially if it's a large trial, large outcome trial, but even for smaller trials too. So that's important to keep in mind as well.
I think we have time for our last question. Unfortunately, we have several ones here, but unfortunately, we have no time for that. But we have here a question to Dr. Mikhail. Have you already experienced any DCT trial results submission for drug indication registration?
Right. So great question. I know that there have been discussions with regulators for sure about certain studies that have decentralized components, maybe not fully decentralized. I am not aware of any studies that's been completed and submitted to regulators and undergoing review. That doesn't mean that there hasn't been any. It's just I'm not aware of any. And of course, there could also be, I'm a cardiologist, so I live in a world where we do cardiovascular trials or cardiometabolic trials, COVID trials that we've done together with Ottavio as well. But there are of course other trials going on, oncology, all kinds of things, that I may not be aware of because that's what I do day in, day out. So, but I know there are definitely discussions going on with regulators.
Yeah, and I think it's once again it's a matter of time because we more and more I think we'll see some decentralized features once again in trials aimed at registration, and I think some people we are now in key positions in regulatory agencies will tend to favor this view, and I think there's a lot of lessons learned from the COVID pandemic with recovery platform trials and other platform trials and pragmatic designs and virtual procedures. And I think that's a legacy that will definitely ended up being applied in cardiology, oncology, pulmonology. I mean, all the big areas where we do trials. But I think we don't have, I don't remember a readily available example, an immediate example that comes to my mind, but it's very likely that we'll see more and more of these features in a very near future. For example, patient-reported outcomes definitely are something that are becoming more and more, used in trials, even in registration trials, and even as the primary endpoint of some trials.
May I add one thing? It's not directly toward that question, but just because I'm just looking at so many questions from the audience. Yeah, it's amazing. But a few of them are related to more technical points, like can you use AI and NLP to process the data? Yeah, sure. The question is, how good is it? We still don't know. We haven't done. Perhaps it would be a good question to ask from the methodological point of view. Some of the designs can be more linked to real-world data. Some will not. Will be pretty much like RCTs. So there's be some considerations for that. One more comment, just not to let everybody without any posting. And this one is more about how we will deal with possible bias. Again, this is a learning phase, and I think a careful design is always there. I mean, bias might happen in any kind of studies, but these ones will actually offer a good opportunity to control for biases as well. Remember, you are in direct contact with the patients. This is, again, a unique opportunity to double check one information with the patients. If there's anything wrong with the data, you might have, again, we have to think about the consequences for that, but you might have the opportunity to get in touch with the patient and ask that question directly. So there's pros and cons as always, but definitely it's a nice journey that we are just embarking at this point. And I definitely very keen on being able to answer those questions. Some I still don't have any experience or answer so far. But guys, you've been again provoking good questions throughout this session, and I don't know if we'll be able to answer those and send those back to you. I wish we could.
Yes, Camila, we'll have to do another session because I was looking, Mikhail, we have over 80 questions still to be addressed. So we'll try to share some of this with the panelists, and maybe we can get back to you. This has been recorded, as you know. There's a lot of registrations, and people usually also check this presentation later, but yes, I mean, I think it shows that we have a growing interest in the topic, and let us tell, we have people from CROs, from hospitals, from clinical trials units, from AROs, from several pharmaceutical companies here. Thank you very much. We have people from not only from Brazil, Mikhail, we have people, we just saw people from the US, people from Europe, so that's why we kept the answers in English, because it's ended up being an international audience. And we have people from startups and from small companies as well that are starting, they're interested in data and in clinical trials. So I think it shows that there is a huge interest in the topic. But I'll give the word back to Camila to the final remarks. Unfortunately, time flies, right? I mean, it's 8:30 in Brazil, and 90 minutes was like I thought we were just starting, but it's already 8:30.
Dr. Mikhail, Dr. Otávio, and Dr. Edson, I'd like to thank you for all this knowledge that you shared with us this night. Thank you so much to all our participants of this event. And we hope that we have another event to address all these questions that were not possible to answer. It was a pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you so much.
It was wonderful to be with you. Thanks so much.
Bye, Miguel. Ciao.
Thank you very much. Until the next one. Bye-bye. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Obrigado.
Obrigado.